let's get started. I'm going to talk today about a master that nobody here cares about, named Fiore and Liberi, as well as a couple other masters you may not have heard as much about. Fiore is how I say it. Brief disclaimer, I don't actually speak Italian. I don't actually speak German. Well, I took Italian in college. The only languages I actually speak with any degree of competency are English and Spanish. So I'm going to pronounce all the Italian words like they're Spanish words, basically. And the German, we'll all just have to try and do our best. Okay. And apparently if I walk directly this way, I block the projector. Can everyone see this? Not really? I don't suppose anybody can make this taller, is there? This is what we have?
You should probably stand here so that people can have 6 more feet of hearing.
Yeah, but if I stand here, then I can block that many more lines of sight to the tiny screen. That's my concern.
Or you could stand up
Down in a chair.
But then I can't control the slides. More suggestions, everyone. Time out.
Nothing together.
All right, so we'll do our best, basically. Now, what I'm going to talk about, give a little bit of intro, which I mostly just did, cover briefly some bio sketches, tell you who these 3 guys I'm going to talk about are. One named Fiore, one named Filippo Vadi, and one named Ludwig von Abe. The 3 masters whose names we can pick out of this massive manuscripts we're going to cover. Then I'm going to talk briefly about how Fiore's treatise, Il Fiore d'Italia, works and how it's set up and how it's easily the best of all the manuscripts that we're going to cover. And then I'm going to talk about 4 more manuscripts that are German in origin that you've probably never heard of, which I like to call the Luminous Kampfs because that's German for the flower of battle. None of them actually have titles. Oh, are we going to make this taller?
We're going to put it on a table.
This is exciting.
This could go very poorly.
You could go well.
And through it all, I'll try to make as many jokes as possible since I know you all really want to eat. So, I'll try to make it entertaining at least.
Excellent use of geometry.
You guys are problem solvers.
Filippo would be proud. Engineering supplies.
Now we need to get going. I hope this has that stuff.
Very. Yeah, and so then I started. No, actually, it's so.
I like this.
Then come out and start hitting.
I would be doing
That's fine.
Not getting any better.
Can you adjust the keystone on the projector?
No, it does not have that. So,
Trevor.
okay, now, modern projectors have this thing called keystone correction, which makes pictures not look like this. However, we don't have that, so we'll just make do. We're going to have trapezoidal slides. That's fine. For those of you who haven't met me yet this weekend, am Michael Chidester. I run a website called WigtonHour.com, which is the place you can go to look at some manuals and see some of the source materials. That's its job. It actually has everything that I'm going to cover today on it, more or less in its completeness. Still working on a few odds and ends, but we have lots of translations if you want to learn more. And then you can join Charles' group if you're in Boston. So, we're going to start with this guy named Fiore de Liberi, Fiore Forlano. He was from an Italian state called, one second.
Really?
I'm not going to rely on my notes, but I want to have them out. Okay, because when I move slides, they're not all on the slides they go to. I apologize for some of these slides. I deleted my slide set 2 days ago and had to rebuild it last night, basically. And I think it came out pretty well based on that. So he was from a state called Friuli, which is actually in the very upper northeast corner of Italy. Today, it's in Italy. To the north of it is Austria. To the east is, I believe, Slovenia.
Right.
Back, what's that?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Back in his time, however, that whole region was what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which we tend to think of as Germanic, but it definitely overlapped a whole bunch of other modern countries, including this one. So the interesting thing is that particularly Friuli in his time had a much more Germanic culture than obviously the modern Italian state of Friuli has today. Fiore himself was most likely a member of a Germanic knightly class. We're not entirely sure which one because his surname that we think of, Liberi, means free, and he refers to himself as a noble, but there were actually 3 different kinds of free nobles in and around that time period, 3 different social classes he could have belonged to. Probably he was a member of one of the ancient Liberi families, Edelfrei they were called in German, or he may have been one of the more recent imperial free knights, which were just starting to become a thing in his time period. He mentions being located at this sort of crossroads of Italian and German culture, that he studied with a lot of German and Italian masters. Again, we think of him as an Italian master, but he says right off that he studied with Germans, and his style has a lot more in common with what we see in some of the German traditions than in other Italian styles like the Bolognese and so on. We actually know more about his life than most masters that we study, especially among the Germans. We know that he was probably born in the 1350s, possibly 1340s, based on the fact that he mentioned he had studied fencing for 50 years in 1409. We know that in 1381 he was probably in Perosa. We know that in 1384 he was fighting a civil war in the capital of Friuli, which is actually a pretty archetypal German civil war in that the secular nobles were trying to kick out their ecclesiastical overlord. This being a German state, it was run by a prince archbishop called the Patriarch of Aquileia. And that civil war lasted for quite a while, but we know that between 1383 and 1384, he was working as a magistrate, a peace officer. He's mentioned in the records of the council 5 times. That by itself makes him far and away the 15th century fencing master that we know the most about. Now, he seems to have made his living after the war by training guys for duels. However, they weren't the kind of duels that ended in anyone dying. At least the 2 that we have found in the historical records so far were fought basically to a draw or a stalemate. They were basically just there to demonstrate ability with arms. So it wasn't the kind of dueling that we tend to think of today. In fact, in one of them, no one took any injury at all. And the other one, they really didn't want to kill each other. That was between Galeazzo Gonzaga and a French marshal named Jean II. I'm not going to try and pronounce his last name. It's not important. His war name was Boucicaut. I have less ability with French than I have with any other European language, probably. Thank you, Fab. And Boucicaut, and they only actually fought a mounted bat on, a dismounted bat on spear because of reasons, and then they were about to go to pole axes where they could really hurt each other when they were told to break it up and bro hug it out. Because, as Richard Marsden likes to say, the medieval European aristocracy was really more of a brotocracy, and they were all just that was kind of how their culture was. So they man-hugged it out, made peace, and moved on. Fiore mentions 6 duels between famous nobility in his time and other random dudes they fought. none of which were necessarily lost by his students, which is why he was bragging about it. And then around 1404-ish, he seems to start writing books. He wrote 4 books, or at least there are 4 manuscripts currently existing today that have his writings in them. I'm going to take back what I just said because most likely he didn't personally create any of them. They were all created later on as copies of his book. But let's talk about them. The probably oldest one is referred to as the Morgan version. It's in the Morgan Library Museum in New York City. That's its manuscript designation, not important. It is a very lovely book, which looks terrible in these scans, but when you see it in person, it's actually much nicer. It gives you an idea of how Fiore tends to lay out his treatise. He illustrates every single play, which is an amazing thing when you come from a tradition like I do initially, which is all words and no pictures. And then he also, in this version and the next one, which is called the Haiti version, is currently in Los Angeles, gives you these excellent full paragraphs. Well, they look like paragraphs, they're really bad prose poetry, basically, that's supposed to rhyme but doesn't always, and it's not important. We tend to translate it as paragraphs in English because it's just easier. But the third version actually has clearly cast poetry. Doesn't mean it's any higher quality, but it is laid out in verse. And this is actually the one that we had the most access to when I was starting out. The other 2, people knew of them, people had microfilm scans of them. This was the only one that was easily available. And as you can see, it has the least information, which is why Fiore studies started off slow. We call this the Vadi version, or the Pisarodossi manuscript, because even though we've recently, in the past decade, discovered where this manuscript lives, after it was thought lost in World War II, no one's managed to actually go see it yet, because the family that owns it thinks HEMA is silly, and talked to some crazy HEMA people early on, and doesn't want anything to do with us. Vadi gave us a facsimile in 1902, Francesco Vadi. Unfortunately, it's hard to say how accurate this facsimile is because some art critics have looked at it and said that it looks like a 19th, 20th century redrawing of a medieval manuscript more than it looks like a medieval manuscript. So until we get those scans of the original, we won't know how reliable these pictures are. But they are there. And they're actually my favorite illustrations of the 4 because I really like how much detail they have in the dagger section. And the last one, which was actually initially uncovered by our good friend Ken Monshine here several years ago, 2008. In Paris, is quite different from the others. It actually has fully painted color illustrations. It has the same sorts of short poetic snippets as the Pisarodossi, but in really, really terrible Latin. Like, I'm not convinced the guy who translated it speaks Latin.
No, it's really good Latin. It's just you need to be Tom Leone to understand it. That's all. So.
I don't know. I've had my Latinists look at it, and they take like hours to translate a page. So
it's hard.
And it was probably translated from a book very similar to this one, but into Latin after Fiore's death. But it does have the prettiest pictures. So you know, there's that. Let's talk about what Fiore did, because it'll be interesting to compare it with the German manuals I'm going to talk to you next did. He actually lays it out in one of the most logical fashions of any fencing manuscript from this period. Way more than any German manuscript I can think of. Every single section, just about, follows this order that he explains in his preface, where he says, okay, we're going to start, I'm going to show you masters standing in guards, then I'm going to show you master remedies, which tell you how to counter attacks using those guards. And then I'm going to show you variations on those counters. And then I'm going to show you how to counter the counter. And that's a new master color, master contrary. And then occasionally we'll go to the next level and do the counter to the counter to the counter. The contra contrary. And I'll show you one later on that actually goes 4 layers deep. The counter to the counter to the counter to the counter. That's very rare. But he also gives them these symbols. If they're wearing a crown, that means they win, and it means they're a master. If they're wearing a garter, it also means they win, but it means they're a student. And the crown and garter means they're a counter master. Counter master is also just good at crown and garter. It doesn't get any more complex than that. But he's actually remarkably faithful to that in most of his material, which means you can look at a Fiore play, read the text, and pretty instantly know what's going on. Very nice. He covers a whole hell of a lot of content because he's probably the only fully integrated fencing system of this time period. Compared to Johannes Lichtenauer, who is the preeminent German master of the 14th to 15th centuries, he covers longsword, armored spear, and some mounted stuff, and a little bit of dagger. Fiore, on the other hand, covers mounted spear, mounted sword, mounted grappling, dismounted versus mounted, how to use a spear on foot. He covers armored/unarmored spear, whether this armor kind of varies from version to version. How to do random mixed weapon combinations like 2 clubs and a dagger versus a spear. I love that one.
Show me the closet.
He covers poleaxe, including this ninja poleaxe where he tells you how to mix this blinding powder that'll make your opponent's eyes swell shut, and then put it in a hollowed out poleaxe head and fling it in their face to win a duel. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? And he also has normal poleaxe plays, but that's the best one. And I love how he explains it in his treatise. He says, and I know that you, his patron, would never ever use this, but just so you know what somebody else might do, I'll give you detailed instructions on exactly how to do this. Very polite. He covers armored longsword. He covers quite a bit of unarmored longsword material in 2 sections, and unfortunately, in my opinion, his unarmored longsword is probably the weakest part of this book. And it's unfortunate because that's the only part that human people care about. So because it's kind of hard to understand, it gets less attention than it deserves. He talks about wide plays, exemplified by that guy kicking the other guy in the groin, and narrow plays, exemplified by that sword-assisted throw, which borrows from the half-swording material and the dagger material. And he also talks about how to use a longsword in one hand, for reasons he never really explains, but it's a good skill to have. It's possible that all the longsword teachers started with single-hand swords, so why not? And then he goes into, again, how to use the sword against the dagger and how to use the dagger against the sword. He talks about dagger versus dagger. He talks about unarmed versus dagger. He talks about seated baton against dagger. He talks about straight-up grappling. Essentially, every weapon you can find in a fencing manual in this time period appears in his book and uses basically the exact same set of techniques as every other weapon, which you just don't see anywhere else. And I find it very interesting. It was so interesting, in fact, that about 60 years later, this dude named Filippo Vadi Pisano shows up and creates a semi-copy of his work. Now, who was Vadi? We're not exactly sure, but we have 2 suspects about who Vadi was. One of whom was, please don't destroy this. One of whom was the governor of Reggio. He was basically an Italian noble who worked for the family that Fiore wrote his book for, and did lots of interesting stuff. The other one was a medical student in the town that those guys lived in, who may have had access to their library because he was a student there and worked as a doctor. I don't know. These are the 2 guys. But the interesting thing is, by and large, he produced a very close copy of Fiore's teachings. The only big differences are that he names all the longsword stances something different for no readily apparent reason, just changes the names around. And he has a little bit at the back of dagger plays with no explanation. Just sort of, here's how it starts, and here's how it ends, so figure it out. And he has like 10 of those. But other than that, he's giving you a version of Fiore with often the exact same text. And then at the beginning, he appends a whole bunch of text-only portion. There's some dispute over whether it's an extension of Fiore's style or a completely different, possibly Pisan style that he was also converting with. But by and large, yes.
Is it then maybe the Teilhofer of the Italian longsword tradition?
Could be.
Lots of pictures and no text?
He has a, kind of. He has a lot of text at the beginning, and then a lot of pictures that aren't really related to it very much,
Like Teilhofer?
with very little text.
Yeah, like Teilhofer.
Sure. We'll go with that. So, but by and large, we can look at him as a continuation of Fiore's tradition. Probably not as his actual fencing style, though. He probably just saw Fiore's book, thought it was cool, made a copy of it, and sold it or donated it to someone for favor. But enough with the Italians. Everyone knows all this Italian stuff. Talk about the interesting stuff, which is the German stuff, right? Everyone knows the German stuff is more interesting. So let's talk about Ludwig VI von Abe, who was actually a fairly important noble in his time period. That's the castle he was born in 1450, Castle Sommersdorf. His father was also Ludwig von Abe. He was a knight. He went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 1476. Member of the Knight of the Order, blah, blah, blah. He married a duchess. That's a picture of her on the front of his fencing manual. Very nice, marital bliss. You can see actually he included her coat of arms because she found it was more noble than his was. That was 1478. That's his castle, which he got in 1503 after being victorious in war. Castle Hardenstein. After that, he was known as Ludwig von Abe zum Hardenstein. That's an old painting of it. That's what it currently is. Still there. This is a battle that he commanded in. He was actually a pretty serious warlord for a while. He fought in the Landshut War of Succession. And I love this guy because we probably know more about him than any other fencing master of his time. There are whole books in German about his life that I can't read because I don't speak German, but we can very closely trace his entire career. So we know that, for example, on August 9th, 1504, he burned Castle Froberg. Let's see who he'd been besieging since August 2nd. And then on the 10th, he led an army against 700 inhabitants of a town, burned that to the ground, picked up 6,000 more Bohemian mercenaries. This particular battle, I believe, is Bergenfeld, where he was commanding 14,000 Bohemian mercenaries. One of the largest armies moving at that time in this war. So he was a pretty serious guy, and he pretty much knew what was what in war. Even though his side lost the Landshut War of Succession, it was a political loss. He was actually victorious in the field. And the emperor intervened, and, you know, winning a war doesn't always mean you win the war, apparently. But he apparently did good enough that he got a castle out of it, so you can't fault him for that. These are two guys that he served. Let's see, he was Hofmeister to Bishop William von Eichstätt. He was Hofmeister to Otto II, Count Palatine of the Rhine. And then he became Vice Dom later on. That, I believe, would be Bishop William on the left and Otto on the right. And then this here on the left is Frederick, Count Elector Palatine of Bavaria, who he was Grosshofmeister to, and that is a drawing that a child put in crayon in the margin of his manuscript. That was presumably later on, but I needed something to fill up that slide, so there it is. You could actually do a pretty interesting presentation on children's crayon drawings in fencing manuals, because they seem to show up more than you think. A lot of rich people won't take care of their manuscript collections. But, so enough of that. The interesting thing about Ive, aside from the fact that he's a known historical figure, is that he did all kinds of different kinds of fencing. He was not only a major warlord, he also was a member of a tournament society called the Unicorn, and participated in nightly tournaments all the time. He wrote a tournament book, that's the cover on the right, in addition to writing a fencing manual there on the left. With his life on the cover, he also wrote a Kunstbuch and a Waffenbuch, both of which are currently lost. But he was a tournament fighter, a battlefield warrior, and also he participated in this more Fiore-style dueling fencing. So he presumably knew what was up. And the fact that he is also a very close parallel to Fiore tradition is quite interesting to me. Now, in addition to Abe, there are two anonymous manuscripts we're going to talk about. One of which dates at the 1420s, roughly around 1428, which was shortly after Fiore finished his career. And that's the one on the left. On the right, one from 1623. The one on the left, I like to say, gives it its age, this tradition we're going to talk about, because 1428 is more or less contemporaneous with Fiore himself. Whereas the one on the right, 1623, gives us gorgeous, gorgeous illustrations of Lench connected doing Fiore poleaxe, for example, in really colorful clothing. What Ludwig van Eyck gives us is actual descriptions of what's going on. You really have to put all three together to get a complete look at this treatise, as it were. The original one from 1428 has very crude pen drawings like this, or pencil drawings rather. It covers a wide range of things that are similar to Fiore, but not identical, with a lot of minor variations, and some unique content as well. You can see here, all the treatises in this tradition have some of this mounted stuff. They have spear and poleaxe, quite similar to Fiore, although this guy seems to be using some kind of spiked two-handed mace for some of the poleaxe plays. Here's some more axe. It covers armored sword and shield. This would be the only manual that actually has text that covers armored sword and shield. Very nice. Only 3 plays. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you know, it's better than nothing, which is what we have without this. He also covers armored longsword. We have unarmored longsword. And again, you can notice it looks quite similar to Fiore type stuff. We have some not as much Fiore stuff, like how to unscrew your pommel and throw it at your opponent. That's a good move. Look at that.
That's in some other German sources, right?
We've got, I assume you have to have a certain kind of sword to do that without all of your handle falling apart. Like his didn't, but you know, if you're desperate. He covers the same kind of dagger material, dagger versus longsword. He has one of the signature Fiore plays of what to do when someone grabs the front of your shirt and has a dagger. Fiore covers that at length. He was really serious about how to defend yourself against a guy grabbing the front of your shirt for whatever reason. And that appears in here. Lots and lots of grappling. And then also some uniquely German type stuff, like fighting with long shields and maces, and some really interesting sword and buckler stuff. It doesn't really look like anything else I've seen in sword and buckler, except for the Cluny manuscript, which is not really accessible to us, and which I'm not going to talk about more. But lots of sword and buckler plays. Now the nice thing is, Abe gives us text for, oh, sorry, let me finish my thought here. He also covers fighting with daggers and big spiked shields, hiding behind a tree, while a guy rides at you with a spear, and of course, the sword dance, because you have to have a sword dance, right? So, the interesting things about what the German material gives us is, first of all, there's text for only a few of the sections. Armored longsword and armored spear, armored dagger, and grappling, basically. And also long shield, but who does long shield, right? Who really cares about that? The grappling has over 100 plays. Good for you, man. You're the only one. So where Fiore gives us only a couple of pages of grappling techniques, which he says are the best techniques he's proven himself, good for killing people and so on, these manuals give us well over 100. Now, Sean Hay suggested to me that what Fiore actually says is there are 2 kinds of wrestling. One is for sport, and one is for seriousness, for killing. And Fiore was giving you the serious stuff. This could be all the stuff he left out that was part of his tradition, because it's for sport. But it involves throws that grab your opponent's belt. Something we don't do in Hema very much. Lots of, arm wrestling, kicking, grapevines, high throws, ground fighting. And this, a couple of random plays of guys strangling each other with veils. I don't really know what the deal with that is. Apparently, Pedro Monte also mentions this as a weird kind of wrestling Germans do. But we have some pictures here. That's kind of nice, right? Monte didn't think much about anything Germans did, but no one really believed this happened until reading in Monte, until we started finding pictures in iconography, including these. I think this should be at IGX next year, personally. I'd like to see that. So, for armored sword and shield, I'm going to cover in a little more depth because it's the one thing that we don't really have in HEMA, and no one really has seen many sources. This is actually not from this tradition. It's from a treatise called Bellafortis, which is a treatise on siege warfare that randomly has a picture which says, you're fighting a guy on the field and the sun is shining, make sure you polish your armor so it will reflect off it and blind him. And that's what's happening here. But he has exactly 3 plays of sword and shield, one of which is a spear and shield. This text basically just says, throw your spear at him. There's some context to it, doesn't really matter. This one says, hold your shield high and thrust underneath. Anyone want to guess what the third one is? Hold your shield low and thrust over top. And apparently that's really all there is to armored sword and shield, because he moves on from there. It covers exactly one side of one page in Ludwig von Abe. And I showed you that page earlier. And then there's 3 different pictures here from the pretty version. Now, he also has 2 random uncaptioned images, which I don't know what the hell's happening in these. That one has fish hooks on his shield, and the other guy is holding some kind of really huge harpoon. And those guys are both carrying like 7 weapons each. They even got poleaxes like strapped to their hips for some reason, because that's totally a thing you would do with a poleaxe, is strap it to your hip, just in case. So, move off of that. The really interesting stuff that happens is when you start comparing this to Fiore. Because I told you all of the crazy stuff that Fiore does, whereas building them we can really reconstruct with reliability. The New Orleans crew is late.
Yeah, the hotel's on fire.
Okay.
Fire trucks are actually true.
What?
Hotel's on fire, apparently, guys. We'll worry about that later. Just leave that there. That'll happen later. So, unfortunately, the parts that we have, like I said, with text, do not include the longsword. So even though there's lots of really evocative, Fiore-esque longsword positions like these, we don't actually have any description. What we do have is dagger, armored longsword, and grappling. And in each of those sections, he includes way more content than Fiore does. On the other sections where Fiore has text, he also often has more content. So you can sort of put them side by side and start seeing how he fills in some gaps in our knowledge. For example, the third master of dagger. Here's a comparison of the images. I think it's a pretty safe bet they're probably doing the same thing. I mean, I can't be 100% sure. What Fiore says is you will go to the ground because of your lack of knowledge, and in armor this is a particularly safe throw. And then basically he talks about how this is an awesome throw, and it will throw you on the ground a whole lot, and you'll be totally dead. Basically, this whole paragraph says nothing at all about how the technique is done. Like, with this method, you'll be driven into the ground, but I cannot make a safer throw being armor. But even without armor, there's nothing you can do. And even if you were strong and powerful, I was still able to do this to you, right? Then we go over to the German stuff, and not only does he give us a whole huge paragraph, but he explains how many steps to take and where to take them, and gives you a whole huge explanation of the exact mechanics of the throw, which I'm not going to read because my voice is already gone from yelling over it. But I will share this with you later if you want to read it yourself. Another excellent Fiore technique from Dagger, also interestingly enough from the third master, which they both cover exhaustively. Fiore loves this master too. The lower bind and lock. He actually calls it the lower key because there's this thing in Romance languages where you don't lock something, you close it with a key. But what he means is lock, as we would say in English. So what Fiore says, this is called the lower lock, also known as the strong key, and from this bind I can kill you, whether you are armored or unarmored, because from here I can strike you, blah blah blah, basically talking about how awesome this hold is. Again, Fiore has this habit sometimes of not really telling you what to do, but just telling you how awesome it'll be if you pull it off. It's one of the my less favorite things about his treatise, although it is occasionally hilarious. But again, when we go over into the the Ludwig von Abe material, then he says, well, when someone wants to strike you from above, so you will stoop down and catch the strike on your hand by his arm, and step around with 2 steps and twist his arm up around the back, and shove your left arm through it to hold him by the shoulder, and wait his arm up and throw him on his face because he must fall or break his arm. Not concise, but very, very precise. And you know what? All of us have already figured out how to do this because we've had Fiore for a long time, but the description matches perfectly exactly what you're supposed to do. And his little additional and taking the 2 steps actually makes it work a whole lot better than what I was doing before. We'll do one more. Go to sword and armor. What the hell's happening here, you might say? I don't know, because the problem is in Fiore there's actually 2 distinct plays, depending on which version you look at, that have this picture. So that happens in Fiore sometimes, because all the versions that we have are sort of fragments of the overall art. But what he says is, this play is also the stance of the true cross in this way. That is, when the scholar is in that guard and the player comes against him, suddenly attacks, they'll let you step out of the way, thrust the point in his face, as you see here. Okay, pretty good. He basically says, okay, you're going to use this guard, you're going to cover and thrust in the face. Now Ludwig von Abe agrees, that's how you do it. But he again gives you this exhaustive detail. So push it, move in and push his point outward, upward and away, and then the outward motion approach ever more strongly afterward, and bind in by his left in between your hand with the blade and the piece in thus to the back, and stab at his left leg. If he prohibits this, so let your sword drop over the pommel and seize him strong by the leg, and it goes on from there. So it gives you the same instruction in more detail, and then gives you follow-ons. It's a beautiful thing having more than one master who actually understands how these techniques are done. Wonderful opportunity, because the main problem with Fiore is that even though there's 4 versions plus Vadi, if one of them doesn't give you information, probably none of them do. Now, I'm sort of winding down here. You want to have dinner, I want to have dinner, so we'll go over one more thing, which is this whole extra part. Some of you have probably heard of a series of treatises called Gladiatoria, which are often, thanks a lot, New Orleans guys, which are often well regarded as being pretty much the only early 15th century German tradition that's not Lichtenauer. And they're cool for that. There's 5 versions. One of them is in Krakow, one of them is in Connecticut. I've seen that one, it's very pretty, very small. That one's in Vienna on the lower left. The one on the lower right is in Paris, and it's under lock and key where we can't see it.
Actually, yeah.
Those Parisians. You can?
He can.
Oh, he can. Well, somebody ought to tell us stories about what it's like. And nice. That's something. The one in the upper left is the really interesting one. It's in Wolfenbüttel, which is a place in Germany. And the interesting thing is, it has more than just Gladiatoria in it. It has all the same plays as the other versions, and then a whole crapload of extra stuff, like 30 extra dagger plays. It's got a whole longsword section with 40-something longsword positions. It's got unarmored spear. It's got some really weird sword and buckler and wrestling. But the longsword material might look familiar to someone familiar with Fiore and Liberi. And actually, the, again, play of how to deal with somebody who grabs the front of your clothing. Another one of Fiore's favorites, the 5th Master of Dagger. Shows up here in all this Gladiatoria finery, but nowhere, none of the other versions of Gladiatoria have that guy. Apparently, scattered among this manuscript is a whole extra set of teachings. Now, Reinhard Lang speculates that it was some random artist's journey book, and he was going through copying things down that he found in random places. So the original source for these Fiore-esque plays is probably not this treatise, but probably something else that he found and made a copy of. But the interesting thing is how well it fits into Fiore's teachings. Here in the lower part, you can see a setup and conclusion of a technique. It's basically dagger play. When you come to a bind, you grab your opponent's forearm and wrap up, and you can grab his cross. And you choke him slightly higher on the wrap. Instead of grabbing his arm, you can grab his sword, grab his crossbar. Now this treatise agrees. However, it follows on from there. If you do that, and then you go to strike the person, he actually has a counter he can perform there in the middle. But all is not lost. Even if he takes your sword away, you also have a counter. You can end up in that cool, ridiculous reverse sword position, where you take the sword that you stole and flip it around and stab him with it. Did we lock Jeff out?
Yay.
Come right in.
Thank you.
No, it's fine. I'm winding down. So this actually is something I'm working on right now. And Charles, where are you, Charles? Charles over there, Boston Army Salary now, is helping me with that too, interpreting some of this. And my first impression of this stuff is it looks like some other German master who wasn't familiar with Fiore's writings tried to write down the same techniques. And that's also been Charles' impression. Unfortunately, as you can see, while there is space for words at the bottom, there are no words there. So this is another one where we can look at it and try and apply our Fiore knowledge to develop additional techniques. But we'll have to find the original to really know what the master actually said about them. And that's basically where I'm going to leave you. For further reading, if you're interested, there are a couple of books on Fiore out there. A really great one on the system by Bob Charette. Tom Leone, of course, published a translation of the Getty version. And there are some books in Italian that you probably can't read. But if you read Italian, they're really well researched and well done. And they have way more information than the English ones. So, what are your questions?
Is this all with error?
All? Well, we don't have permission to put the color scans in the Wiktionary yet, but there are black and white scans of that last one up. And I don't have a translation of the long shield material yet. So if you really wanted to see that, someday soon. However, I did secretly put up translations of the armored longsword, the dagger, and the grappling stuff in the article called De Limitis Kampfs by a colleague of mine named James Wallhausen. And he gave me a draft translation, which is quite serviceable. Hasn't actually been announced, but since you all are my friends, I will tell you that it's there and you can read it at your pleasure with the appropriate images alongside, from the pretty version, obviously. Other questions? Oh, and for Fiore, there is a complete translation of everything except for the Getty mounted stuff at the moment. But there is the Morgan mounted stuff, which is exactly the same. So if you want to read Fiore, you can read it in its entirety on the wiki, except for also the Latin version, which is a lot harder to translate.
I've got one coming out from freelance as soon as Bert gets his shit together.
And Ken says that someday soon he will have his translation
No,
out.
it's correct.
But I've
It's
heard
not
that
soon.
before.
It's not soon. It's not soon, it's correct.
More questions?
Finish.
Yes.
So you've told us who Fiore was and who von Eyck was, and you've said a little about who Vadi was. Where was Vadi? Was he also in the Holy Roman Empire chunk of Italy?
We don't really have a lot of information about him. We don't. I mean, Pisa is obviously not in the Holy Roman Empire.
Okay.
It was a city-state. He was associated with Ferrara, which is also Italian. I mean, most of the places we can speculatively tie him to were Italian states. It's unclear at the moment if that means that Fiore's tradition was known among the Italians, or if it means that Vadi found his book in an Italian library, which is where Fiore sent it, and then made a copy of it. But again, Fiore mentions that he was trained by both Italian and German masters. It's my personal belief that his actual written material is based on an older German treatise, but I can't prove that yet. We're still looking. It would make a really neat narrative if it was, but I'm not going to say it's a fact. Did I see a hand back there?
I was going to say, is there a short version of why it's based on an older German tradition?
Not a short version, no. But if you get me drunk later, I'll give you the long version.
I don't know where dinner is.
What's that?
I don't know where dinner is, so go right ahead.
Well, basically, the fact that the German manuscript I showed you and Fiore's have the same illustrations, but the German stuff by comparison is really randomly arranged and really poorly organized and lacks Fiore's special organization coding scheme of crowns and girders, suggests to me that it wasn't copied from his book, but they were both copied from an earlier text that they had in common, and Fiore just improved upon it when he created his. And he said, okay, I mean, he mentions in his own preface that he owned fencing manuals. And we have no idea what he could have owned because only one that's old, or two that are older than his, that we know of. So the fencing manuals that he owned are pretty mysterious to us, and if one of them had these illustrations in it, then he very well might have taken that as his source material and created his treatise as an improvement upon it. That was fairly common. Yes? And also, there's another cool thing, which I didn't show you because I couldn't get on my Google Drive to find. It's not important why I couldn't show it to you. But the high resolution image of the first page of the 1428 manuscript has a name at the top, which matches the name of one of the masters Fiore claimed to study under, or at least is very similar. It mentions the master Nikolai von Eibenstock, which is quite close to Dobeln, and Fiore studied under a Nikolai de Toblum in Latin. And so, probably not significant, but kind of cool. And so, but lacking a better explanation of why we have these two traditions, which are roughly contemporaneous and have the same material but with different presentations, I have to believe that they didn't spontaneously come up with it separately. So either the German stuff is based on Fiore's, and it's just a really, really bad copy of it, or Fiore's is a really, really nice copy of the older stuff that the German stuff was derived from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, please. What do you call this early stuff if it exists? I'm not saying it doesn't. German.
What?
Why do you think this earlier stuff that exists is German?
And you know, there is a reference that someone, I want to say it was Roger, but Roger may have just translated it, found that Fiore went to Paris before he died. And was in Paris in 1418.
That's,
We can't really verify that yet, but
you have to dig, but I'm counting on Dr. Hollenstein here, to dig through the old papers by Vadi and the others. Vadi, let's actually quote all these papers to a library in Milan, but Italy being Italy, the library is probably somewhere, and closer and hard success. So, yeah.
yes, Ken.
I backtracked that. It's completely spurious. It was some fencing master, German fencing master, he was Italian fencing master living and working in Sweden, I believe, in the early 20th century, who conflated the Novati Fiore with God knows what, with actually some record in the census of Philip Augustus, and it's completely spurious. Anglo talks about it. He thinks it's spurious. I think Anglo's right.
Okay, well, fair enough. So you probably didn't go to Paris, which is too bad.
Sorry.
But the reason why I think it was German
You still have classical foil.
is simply because it was probably either Italian or German, and the fact that Fiore was living in a German state and associated with Germans, and everything besides his book and Vadi's copy of it is also in German. It could be Italian that moved north. That's also possible. As I understand it, the pure Italian fighting style from southern Italy was not similar to what Fiore presents, and it does seem more similar to some of the German dueling customs. But that's sort of a shaky branch to hang my hat on. At this point, it's all speculation. We don't know where it came from. Yes?
Are you suggesting that we might actually have not a German and Italian school of fencing, but two German schools of fencing?
Well, I think that there are dozens of schools of fencing. And I think that trying to generalize across Italy or Germany is a mistake, because even within Germany, we have Talhofer doing something weird compared to the other Liechtenauer masters. We have Gladiatoria doing something similar but not quite the same. We've got this material right here that is German in origin, at least in Abe's case, which is not anything close to Liechtenauer, and so on. While there was a lot of exchange of fencing knowledge all over Europe, there were lots of localized traditions that were carried forward, and that's what a tradition is. So, and when you go to Italy, every city-state seems to have their own fencing traditions and their own fencing schools. And so ultimately, I think trying to paint Italy with the Fiore brush and paint Germany with the Liechtenauer brush is probably the first mistake you'd make in that line of speculation. So I stopped calling it the Italian and German schools a long time ago. And you can too. More questions, John?
How many German manuals can you link to Fiore
4.
in any way?
4 treatises, or 4 manuscripts at the moment, compared to Fiore's 4 and Vadi, which makes 5 Italian. I'm still hoping more will surface because at least some of these are very clearly copies of unknown manuscripts. One thing I failed to mention, which I think we'll close on, is the 1623, the very pretty one I showed you, has all of the content of the other 2, as well as more stuff added in that we don't know where it came from. So the guy who painted it had both of those manuscripts and decided for whatever reason to associate them together and make a compiled version, or there used to be a lot more of this, and we're just seeing pieces of it. I hope it's the latter, because this is a lot more stuff to find and a lot more stuff to investigate. And I think I'm done.